For the mayors for the nuclear power-free Japan, we remember your activity throughout this period since the nuclear power disaster after the great earthquake. I have about 10 minutes for my section. And I would like to talk a little bit about what I am currently working on regarding nuclear-free Japan. The currently active nuclear power plants and the people that Russia had actually attacked an active power plant. If that missile or the bombs had actually hit the center of the power plant, I wonder what would have happened. And I actually mentioned this in the Diet meeting assembly. To actually attack a nuclear power plant that is currently active, the damage that could have been caused could have been even worse than what happened in Fukushima. What this means is that to have power plants in your country is a national safety risk. It is a large, huge risk. This is an event that actually gave awareness and rise to this risk. We discuss about we need to start activating some of our nuclear power plants that because we are lacking electricity, and that we will work on the anti-terrorist measures later. But these people who are having this type of discussion really do not understand the reality. And these people are having the discussion in our Diet meetings. When we think about electricity and electrical power, we need to think about renewable energy. I have provided to you some materials about the changes that we have had in the past 10 years and the materials that I have presented at the Diet meeting the other day. Of course, I believe you are all very much aware of all of this situation, but 10 years ago, 0.3% was solar power 10 years ago. Currently, it is 7.9, close to being 10%. Unfortunately, wind power is 0.9 from 0.3, which is not a very big rise. So I did some research regarding solar power. There is a word called solar sharing. I believe you know this terminology as well. This is to utilize solar energies and solar rays and use it for multiple purposes. For example, growing crops like rice or vegetables. And then above that, we will set solar panels. And we will have spaces between the panels so that half of the light, because the sun actually moves, the ground will receive half the light and half the light will be collected by the solar panels. And almost all vegetation can grow in this type of condition, and that there is only a certain amount of solar rays that vegetation or plants require, so that even having solar panels above the farming areas does not cause a problem to the growth of the crops. I want to strongly support this because the Ministry for Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery is putting a strong effort behind this activity, which is now called the Farming Photovoltaic Plan. In Japan, many of the flat land is already being used for agriculture. And I thought that putting more solar panels in Japan would be difficult because of this land situation in Japan. But if we can put the solar panels above the agricultural areas, we can put it above the 4 million hectares of land that we are currently using for agriculture. In 1 year, this means that the amount of rays that can be collected in the 365 days, can calculate it being 1,000 hours, which will be 500 watts times 1,000 times the 4 million hectares. I keep on repeating do the calculation, and I brought it to the diet meeting and explained my calculation. Basically, this will give us 2 trillion kilowatt hours. 2 trillion kilowatt hours. How much is this? The amount of electricity that Japan currently uses is 1 trillion kilowatt hours. So that the total of the Japanese current electricity consumption, the farming photovoltaic plant would actually be able to cover twice that amount if we can put the solar panels above all of the farming areas in Japan. I used this graph and I explained to the ministers, including the Ministry for Economy, Trade, and Industry. This means the farmers will be able to grow crops and also create solar power. And the ministry is very much for this idea. They do not want the farming land to be converted to buildings, but they are happy as long as the farming continues and that it can be used for other purposes as well. In simple calculation, twice the amount of electricity that Japan uses today can be created just by putting solar panels above all our farming land. I would sincerely want you to also promote this idea in the areas that you are in. 10 years ago, when we experienced the Fukushima power plant incident, I was a prime minister at that time. And I think this is one of the key reasons why I strongly oppose nuclear power, and we need to move to clean energy. And I want to create a Japan that will be free of nuclear power, and I want to continue to put effort into this topic. It's a bit of a long message from me, but thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Mr. Kan. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Sato. I am the MC for this meeting. I forgot to announce 2 topics for today. The first one is this is an international symposium, and for members who are joining in through Zoom, these are people from the media as well as our members. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is an interpreting function. Here, you can select your language. Please select the appropriate language for you. Many of the people who are watching us through YouTube, it will only be aired in Japanese. Another key point, because of the International Symposium, I wanted to ask Sakurai-san for his opening remark, but I forgot to ask Sakurai-san for the opening remark. I sincerely apologize, but will you be able to make the opening remark?
Thank you very much. Since immediately after the disaster, I had the chance, of course, to work together with Mr. Kan, and I thank you for your words as well. There are still 40,000 people who have had to evacuate following the disaster, and the situation is still continuing as well. TEPCO is saying that the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is going to be decommissioned within 40 years as well, but there is no clear sign as to whether this will actually be possible or not. I think this is the reality we are now facing 10 years after the 11 years after the disaster has happened. Of course, recently we have seen the situation in Ukraine, and we see clearly that it is not possible to live together with nuclear power plants. However, despite this, unfortunately, there are still these efforts to cling on to nuclear power. Looking at the issues also of how to decarbonize society, there are moves towards restarting nuclear power plants as well. For those of us who experienced the nuclear plant disaster, this is something we cannot fathom. Today, we have the opportunity to hear about developments in Germany from Mr. Trittin, who is, of course, the former federal minister of the environment and continuing to lead the way in Germany. We will also hear from Mr. Iida Tetsunari as well. And so I am sure there is a lot that we can learn. And I hope that this will be for the purpose of our residents here in Fukushima as well. So I'm looking forward to today. Thank you everybody for sharing your precious time with us today. That's all from me. Thank you, Mr. Sakurai. And just a reminder, those of you who are listening in via Zoom today, we'd like to make sure that you listen to the interpretation, and we are just confirming now that everybody is able to hear the interpretation for today. We are very happy now to introduce our next main speaker, Mr. Jürgen Trittin, who is joining us from Germany today. I would like to explain his background briefly, if I may. He is, of course, a member of the German Bundestag, as part of the Grünen, the German Greens. And since under the Schröder administration, and for many years, he was serving as the federal minister responsible for the environment and nuclear safety as well. We are very honored to have Mr. Trittin joining us here today. I had a chance to learn a little bit about what he will be speaking today, and looking at, of course, the developments which have happened in Germany, particularly looking at what has happened in Germany. And Mr. Trittin himself also visited Fukushima in the year 2012, the year after disaster. So he has this experience as well. Mr. Trittin, we hand over to you now. Mr. Trittin, you're on mute at the moment. I'm afraid we can't hear you, Mr. Trittin.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, clearly.
Sorry for that. That's a pity too. Dear Prime Minister Naoto Kan, dear mayors, thank you for the invitation. Almost 6 years ago, I had the honor to give a laudation on you, Naoto Kan, at the award ceremony for the Courage for the Nuclear Phase-Out Prize. It was not so long ago. And yet it must be said that this in somewhat was a different time 6 years ago. At that time, 195 countries of the world had just reached a far-reaching agreement in Paris to limit the global rise in temperature. The accessor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol was a key milestone in the fight against climate crisis. And at the same time in Europe, the biggest threat to the stability of the European Union was the upcoming Brexit referendum in UK, and Boris Johnson was still mayor of London. And in the US, Donald Trump had not even been officially nominated to the Republican presidential yet. Now, we are faced with a total different world, a world in global crises. With one exception, the US, I must unfortunately be said that the world has not become a better place and certainly is not a safer one. The COVID-19 pandemic showed the world its limits, and it led the world into a contradiction that has not been resolved this day. A global pandemic in an interconnected world can also only be fought by globally, and yet national egoisms have taken hold on massive scale in our procurement of protective materials and so on. The second crisis is the ongoing climate crisis. It's intensifying massively. The statements of the IPCC report are unperturbable in their clarity, but the global measures taken to reduce greenhouse gases fall far short of what it is needed. Mankind continues to race almost unchecked towards an abyss. But this crisis is fatally overshadowed now by a humanitarian crisis in Europe. Behind the war that Russia has launched against Ukraine on flimsy grounds, with tens of thousands of deaths and several million refugees so far. And this war, which is accompanied by massive crimes against humanity, has triggered in the international order a crisis that is substantial. When a member of the UN Security Council so bluntly violates the territorial integrity of the neighboring state, when it even denies the independent right to exist, then the fundamental principles of the UN are called into question. And fourthly, this war, in addition to associated effects on the international energy markets, is leading to a discussion that we actually thought we had overcome since 1990, because the use of tactical nuclear missiles is no longer just a theoretical option. The fact that Russia is the world's largest nuclear power naturally has implications for the world's response to Russian aggression. World War III, that's the bitter, is no longer just dystopia. Against the background of this admittedly gloomy, even fragmentary analysis, the question for which you invited me now arises with very current clarity. The questions are, is a world free of nuclear weapons conceivable? And is a nuclear-free world realistic? Both, I'm convinced, must be answered with a clear yes. The history of nuclear power has always been a question of power, not of electrical power, but of political power. And nobody knows this better than you in Japan. Nuclear power and nuclear weapons have always been and continue to be linked worldwide. Japan's tragic history, the death of hundreds of thousands of people, assigns its country a special role. And yet, the question of stationing of a nuclear weapon had also been raised in Japan. I believe that it is important to discuss the global goal of shutting down all nuclear power plants in the world together with the world goal of freedom for nuclear weapons. That is why we keep getting the debate about nuclear power all over the world. And unfortunately, also in your country, despite Fukushima. Why? When renewable energies are booming worldwide, why do we discuss on nuclear? If we see an energy turnaround started in Germany has made renewables so cheap globally that for almost 10 years in a row now, more renewable capacities has been connected to the grid worldwide than fossil and nuclear. The perpetuity costs for each gigawatt hour of nuclear power are higher, more than double higher than any alternative. In short, nuclear power is not competitive. But we discuss it because nuclear power was less about energy production than about power and political power, and never about competitiveness. You have to see the history of nuclear power to fight for the end. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace marked the beginning of the entry into nuclear energy. This was the speech he delivered to the United Nations in 1953, combined with a campaign in the form of futuristic exhibitions. And within a year, from 1955 to 1957, it even managed to overturn the rejection of nuclear power generation in Japan, which was still at almost 70% against nuclear power in 1955 to 35 in 57. The entry into nuclear energy was about a political requirement of the US and the budding European nuclear powers of the 1950s. Its aim was to control the civil and military use of nuclear power worldwide. As a result, the International Atomic Energy Agency was founded, which from then on was to prevent the misuse of fissile material for the construction of atomic bombs. It was not about energy supply. but about preventing proliferation. The introduction already confirmed what Hermann Scheer, a well-known pioneer for renewable energies in Germany and a social democrat, described as follows: the nuclear age can only be wound down if nuclear disarmament is promoted. Scheer considered the peaceful use of nuclear energy as a chimera. One can also say it differently. There is no Chinese wall between civil and military use of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is double-use technology. What illustrates this better than the technology without no nuclear power plant would function? The enrichment of uranium. Nuclear power, yes or no, has always been a geopolitical question of power. In all cases, the pursuit of the bomb begins with so-called civilian use. There are 5 official nuclear powers today: the US, France, China, Great Britain, and Russia. There are also 4 unofficial nuclear powers: India, Pakistan, North Korea in your neighborhood, and Israel. Moreover, several NATO countries participate in the US nuclear arsenal with the framework of nuclear sharing, including not only Germany, but also Italy, Belgium, and Turkey. But even several states have renounced nuclear weapons in the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, have the technology to build the bomb and use this technology every day. Germany and Japan, for example, operate uranium enrichment plants. This loophole in the non-proliferation regime is Germany's fault. Germany's first nuclear minister was Franz Josef Strauss. He succeeded in having uranium enrichment excluded from the non-proliferation treaty. If Turkey now is seeking nuclear power plants today, it is not the energy supply issue that is likely to concern Erdogan. This is also about access to nuclear technology. Construction began in Akkuyu in 2018 in an earthquake-prone area, built and in the future operated by Rosatom, the state-owned Russian nuclear company, with a largely state-guaranteed kilowatt-hour price of 12.3.5 US cents. This is nearly tenfold compared to solar energy in Qatar. Western intelligence agents reportedly agree that Turkey is at least keeping the nuclear option open. The consequences of the loophole for enrichment in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty extend also today if you look on the discussions on an agreement between some states of members of the Security Council and the European Union with Iran on a comprehensive agreement to limit the enrichment in Iran. But if Iran cannot be stopped from further enrichment, then a nuclear arms race in the Middle East looms. The first nuclear power after Israel will not be Iran, but Saudi Arabia, and after Iran, Egypt will also want to become a nuclear power. My dear ladies and gentlemen, this brief outlook to the geopolitical dimension of the nuclear issue was important for me because it highlights the pressure to act that we have in saying goodbye to nuclear power, and because it illustrates the background against which nuclear lobbies argue when they cite allegedly cheap electricity and climate protection reasons for a niche technology that delivers estimated 4.7% of the world's energy demand. We must not fall for this argumentation. It is misleading. A nuclear phase-out is possible. Germany has taken this path. You asked me in your question how the nuclear phase-out was implemented in Germany after a report of the Ethics Commission in May 2011. This commission was set up under the impression of the terrible disaster in Fukushima, but it was a political sleight of hand and the result of a breach of promise. The actual beginning of the nuclear phase-out was in '98, the year in which a red-green government consisting of the SPD and Green Party in Germany took the task of modernizing the country. This meant for the energy supply out of nuclear power, but into renewable energies. We started down this path in 2000 with the Renewable Energy Sources Act and the Nuclear Consensus. Angela Merkel's successor government had tried to leave this path in 2010 until the 14th December of 2010, where they decided to extend the lifetime of nuclear power plants in that day. Not 3 months later, on March 2011, the tsunami overtook the Fukushima plant, a disaster that statistically speaking should never have been happened. I myself was at Fukushima in 2012. I saw the devastation left behind the tsunami. I spoke with fishermen who had not been allowed to fish for months. I spoke with people who had lost everything there and yet wanted to go back, but were not allowed at that time. I have not forgotten these images, but I don't need to tell you that. On June 30, 2011, the German Bundestag de facto reinstated the original nuclear phase-out roadmap. At the end of 2022, the last 3 nuclear power plants in Germany will be taken off the grid under a government involving Social Democrats and Greens again. The German exit was a planned one, and it changed the world, a process that took over more than 20 years. But we had linked the exit from nuclear power with the entry into new renewable energies. The whole thing is known today as the energy transition. Germany was the first G20 country to go down this path for 20 years, and it did it very successfully. Today, almost 50% of electricity in Germany is generated from renewable energies. That is more than twice the amount that nuclear power itself ever contributed to the electrical supply in Germany. The path was more successful than even its protagonist thought. For instance, when I was responsible minister, launched the Renewable Sources Act in 2000 and amended it in 2004. The law stated that we wanted to have exactly 20% share of renewable electricity in 2020. At that time, it was believed that the share could never technically exceed 8%. In 2015, 5 years earlier, we already produced almost 1/3 of our electricity from renewable sources. That's another way to be wrong. In Germany, more than 20 billion euros have been invested annually in new power generation plants in recent years. Renewable energies make us independent. They reduce the import dependency of traditional energy from uranium to oil and gas. Around 21 billion was turned over in these plants every year in 2021, benefiting farmers, citizens, cooperatives, and funds. The result was an export-rich industry that at times employed up to 400,000 people. In the US, it currently employs 1.3 million people. In 2021, renewable energies avoided in Germany 221 million tons of CO2 equivalents in Germany. Since the year 2000, this value has increased almost 5-fold. And the market structure had also changed. 50% of renewable electricity, most is largely non-corporate. The electricity market has been is dominated now by municipal and regional providers. The plants belong to citizens, farmers, funds, corporations, and cities. who also adapted a guaranteed feed-in tariff model in 2012 in Japan, but only since 2016 has been a real liberalization of the electricity market. We liberalized the electricity market in 2002 That was not least the basis for successful energy transformation. If you want to break the power of monopolies, and you have to empower many stakeholders. That is the core of energy transition. Germany has made the global energy transition possible. Costs have been reduced by over 90%. Today, the reference parameter for cost of kilowatt hour globally is a wind turbine in fierce competition with a photovoltaic panel. The costs in Europe are just under 4 € for solar and wind power per kilowatt hour, not to mention the 1.47 cents in Qatar. And if you may, I would like to quote John Kerry, the former US Secretary of State and Special Envoy on Climate issue from last year. He described it like this. John Kerry, the truth is that the global energy transition is gaining momentum every day, thanks in no small part to Germany's decades-long efforts to be a pioneer in the deployment of clean technology. Germany's pioneering EEG law had created an early market for emerging technology that is now thriving around the world. I've already mentioned it. On 31 of December 2025, the last nuclear power plants in Germany will go off the grid. This means that generation by nuclear is history. But the question of disposal and final storage is far from it. Germany still does not have a final repository for its highly radioactive waste, just like every other country in the world. The first functioning nuclear waste dump will probably start work in Finland in 3 years' time, and it will be finally filled and sealed in 2100. That's the perspective. It is one of the great mistakes in history of nuclear power. We started with high-risk technologies in the hope that science would find a solution to the nuclear problem in the next few years. That was a big mistake. The proof that nuclear waste can be stored safely for more than 1 million years was not provided. So nuclear power plants were operated without knowing what would happen to the nuclear waste. That is like taking off an aeroplane and having not built a runway yet. You know this problem only too well in Japan. From my specific German experience, however, I dare to predict that exporting the waste problem cannot be a good and viable solution. Germany has an almost 40-year history of civil resistance to a politically determined, but technically unsuitable and socially rejected site for repository. This question has preoccupied several generations of politicians, and it would only be solved when a submission-free search process was starting within the framework of a large commission consisting of representatives of all interests and groups. And we organized that we get the money, for example, from the utilities who runs the nuclear power plants for building up and sampling the money for a nuclear waste dump. It was a party of risk minimization. But after a long discussion, we decided to set up a public law fund that took over the deferred money from the companies for the final repository costs, plus a risk premium. This fund is now the largest German sovereign wealth fund and invests former nuclear money, sustainable and very successfully so far, in order to build a repository with this money, probably from 2050 onwards. So we start producing, we finish producing nuclear waste at the end of this year, but to solve the waste problems will realistically start in 2050. Nuclear energy is a bad and expensive heritage for coming generations. The new and actual German government must now eliminate 15 years of mismanagement and the expansion of renewable energies in order to achieve the planned climate goals and to gain energy sovereignty. 70% of Germany's energy demand has to be covered by imports. That limits our sovereignty to act. Firstly, we must reduce our high dependence on Russian energy imports as quickly as possible. Incidentally, this is not a German problem. The whole of Europe is dependent on Russian fossil energy imports. And this concerns not only gas, but also oil, coal, and not at least uranium for nuclear power plants. Therefore, the measure taken now have a similar, fundamental character as when the energy transition starts. We do not only want to reduce the imports from Russia, we want to bring down the fossil energy imports to zero. And we plan to shift the balance from 70% fossil and fissile imports to 70% homemade renewable energy and 30% of imports for green hydrogen, ammonia, and electricity. A little more than 100 days after the start of the new federal government, the Federal Minister of Economics, Robert Habeck, has presented the first package of energy emergency measures, the so-called Easter package. Renewable energies have now become a matter of national security at the latest. Germany will comprehensively accelerate the development of renewable energies on water, on land, and on the rooftops. Renewable energy as a public interest. This is the central point for the acceleration and the stipulation that the use of renewable energy is in the overriding public interest and serves public safety. In doing so, the new government is not least implementing landmark ruling by our highest court. Achieving the 1.5-degree target now has a constitutional status in Germany. This has obliged the federal government to do more for climate protection, because otherwise the civil rights of future generations would be unconstitutionally restricted. Climate protection safeguards civil liberties. And the course is now finally being set for this. The expansion of renewable energies on land and sea will be raised to completely new levels so that Germany's electricity supply is almost entirely on renewable energy as early as 2035. We want to reach 80% as early as 2030 and have already completely phased out coal-fired power plant at that time. New areas are being made available for the expansion of photovoltaics, like I've seen in the opening remarks of Naoto Kan on the agricultural areas. Expanding the participation of municipalities in onshore wind and photovoltaics brings back electricity production to the people and the cities. Improve the framework conditions for the expansion of photovoltaic roof systems. The approval times for offshore wind energy will be massively accelerated. Barriers will be reduced and planning and approval procedures streamlined. That is the Easter package by the new German government. Ladies and gentlemen, by 2035 at latest, Germany will generate its electricity entirely from renewable resources. Now, nuclear power plant will be only a memorial. Coal-fired power plant will no longer be needed. The goal of the current Japanese government is to increase the share of nuclear power to over 20% by 2030. Justification is the climate targets, but this is a contradiction in terms. Before Fukushima, the share of nuclear was around 30% in Japan. However, the transition to a carbon-free industry, which is necessary for the climate targets, will require more electricity. Cars, such as buses and trucks, will be battery electric in the future. Electric heat pumps replace oil and gas heating systems. Electrical application provide high caloric processes in chemical industry. Hydrogen instead of carbon in the steel industry must be generated using renewable energy. We need more electricity for hydrogen in air and sea transport. In Germany, we estimate that the electricity demand then is over 50% more than today. And I think in Japan is likely to be similar. So if you want to go to 20%, you need more nuclear power plants than before Fukushima. So you would have to build more capacities, subsidized with billions of taxpayers' money. Money you need to invest in really clean energy, in efficiency improvements and climate adaptation measures. If we have taken the Paris Agreement seriously, 4/5 of our today's known reserves of oil, coal, and gas must remain underground. This requires affordable alternatives. The world will have to switch to renewable energies to achieve this. The nuclear way is the wrong way. Nuclear power is a dangerous niche energy. Naoto Kan was right. Japan was able to supply itself completely without nuclear power after Fukushima. It can do so in the future too. Renewable energies are not only marketable, they are cheap and they have the only way for real climate protection. Thank you very much for your attention on this Sunday. In Europe, it's Sunday morning. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trittin. It was our honor to hear from you. And of course, in Germany, it is still very early, still just after 8 a.m., we believe. So thank you so much for spending your time today, very early in the morning with us, Mr. Trittin. Following on from here, I'm very happy to pass over to Mr. Iida Tetsunari of the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policies. We will hear from, after these remarks, these keynote remarks by Mr. Trittin, what we should do here in Japan. We have around 15 minutes planned to hear from Mr. Iida. We are actually running a little bit earlier than our planned schedule, but we'll be glad to have some time for questions and answer together from either the mayors joining today's session and also those representatives of the media here today as well. Mr. Iida, over to you. Hello, thank you very much. As introduced, I am Iida Tetsunari, the representative of ISEP. Mr. Trittin, I think at the time when you were the Federal Minister for Environment, we met at the Johannesburg Summit. I was there just as a participant at the time, but I remember very clearly this was at the time of the Bush administration, just following 9/11 and looking at the international political situation, moving from the perspective of environment to looking at security. And there are some similarities I can remember of the general situation we were facing at the time then. After that, there was, of course, Rio+10 at that time. And I remember we were talking about the goals for renewable energy. At the time, the German government was discussing saying that it was going to create the momentum for the international community. I remember Mr. Trittin and also Mr. Schroeder at the time as the minister and the chancellor speaking very strongly about this. And several years after the international conference was held in Germany, and I think this was really the turning point for the international community. As Mr. Trittin mentioned today, or I'd like to take this as some questions about what we need to do here in Japan. And thinking about this, reflecting on these past 11 years since the Fukushima disaster as well, with some comparisons between Germany and Japan. First of all, reflecting back upon these 11 years, there are 3 globally historic events, I believe, which have taken place. And these 3 have been suddenly completely changing what was the everyday before then, completely creating a new normal, we could say. This is, of course, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster. COVID-19 pandemic, which has begun since around 2 years ago, and since 2 months ago, the Russian military invasion of Ukraine. These 3 points have, of course, completely changed globally and also here in Japan. Within these circumstances, there are some words of the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu which come to mind, that the most difficult problems in life always start off being something simple, or this could also mean that these issues might seem like very small things in the beginning. They might seem very small details and you're not sure which way it will go. But if you make the wrong mistake in trying to deal with these small issues, it can lead to immense impacts. When we look at the COVID-19 situation, of course, 11 years ago, the treatment of COVID in Japan first started by the cruise ship called the Diamond Princess, which came into Japan. And Japan's whole response completely was very strange since then. Japan is still one of the countries which has the lowest availability of PCR testing, for example. And so it's almost using this very unscientific way of saying, well, if you have more testing, then there'll be more cases of COVID as well. It seems like finally the situation is changing, is improving, but similar discussions were in place 11 years ago in regards to the Fukushima disaster as well. Mr. Kan, who is here today, was of course the Prime Minister at the time. But if it had not been Mr. Kan in government at the time, for example, if the current government, which has been responding to COVID, I'm afraid to say that I really think that the impacts, the casualties may have been much higher than they actually were under Mr. Kan's leadership. I think small mistakes at the time can lead to immense circumstances, immense impacts afterwards. Also looking at the situation of not making or not having TEPCO process for bankruptcy, the fact that this was not done at that time is still continuing to have enormous implications, negative implications here in Japan. The second is, as Mr. Sakurai, the former mayor of Minamisouma city near the nuclear power plant mentioned, is saying that the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant will be decommissioned in 40 years. And this is still what is being said, but this is where all of the different issues now, for example, the contaminated water release into the Pacific Ocean are coming from as well. The other point, there was, of course, the people who were at the time of the disaster saying that there will be no immediate impacts of the radiation. But we have seen, of course, that this is, of course, not the case. I won't go into the details about these issues, but I think that the greatest achievement which Mr. Kan left and which Mr. Trittin mentioned is looking at the introduction of the feed-in tariff, which here in Japan, I think Mr. Kan really put himself on the line in order to bring this into place in August, the year after the disaster, and this being adopted. That itself was, of course, a very important step. There were, of course, some issues in regards to the implementation of how this is actually the system for this. Japan is now the third PV country in the world as a result of this. This is one of the bright sides of what was implemented. However, it did also create a great shadow behind these lights as well. This is a failure not of Mr. Kan himself, but the government failed to, I think, introduce the necessary schemes in relation for this. The German FIT system was, of course, one of the very early ones, and about 100 different countries around the world introduced them, and Japan was one of the last countries to introduce this. But it made a grave error at this time as well. And this was at the year 2012, deciding to set the tariff at that time and to maintain it from there as well. Of course, after this, there's been various natural deterioration and so on. And so there was this bureaucratic mist, which is still having implementations or implications today. The second, of course, Mr. Trittin mentioned Mr. Trump, and we also heard about the anti-vaccine movement and so on. Fake news also becoming an issue here. When we look at the energy issue, there's a lot of fake news about this here in Japan. People often say that Germany is only able to have its nuclear phase out because it is buying electricity from France, which is using nuclear power plants, for example. This is fake news, which is being talked about in a lot of places, but this is completely false. This is not the true as well. But we also see there is still fake news about this today. If you look at the statistics, if you look at the facts, we can see that this is clearly not the case. But these lies are really just going around. And this is, of course, we see this when it comes to nuclear power. We see this when it comes to Ukraine now as well, as Mr. Trittin and Mr. Kan both referred to. Last year, globally, nuclear power was it actually decreased 5 gigawatts around the world last year. And at the time, and in comparison to that, solar has increased by huge amounts in comparison to that, in tens of millions for both wind and solar, and this increase is expanding every year, whereas nuclear power is only a very small amount now. But also the average lifespan for nuclear power is around 31 years now as well. Until now, there were 198 nuclear power plants, which have been decommissioned since, and their average age was 27 years. So even the current lifespan of the nuclear power plants which are operating, they could be called, grandfathers, grandmothers. They're so elderly compared to those which have already been decommissioned. If we, for example, in Finland said that they were constructing some new ones in 5 years, but I think now it's 17 years. And in March this year, it was when generation only began at Olkiluoto. And also in the UK, there are power plants which said, Hinkley Point, for example, which was said to be constructed in just a few years, and it's going longer and longer. So there is this consistent postponing of even the starting of these, which means that the cost just becomes more and more and more. And we see that, therefore, nuclear power, even if we take all of the risks out of the way, it is not going to be ready in time to deal with climate change. It is not going to be ready in time to provide the electricity that is needed. And of course, once they stop, they cannot just be restarted easily as well. There was a time in March this year in Japan when we had a risk of a shortage of electricity. But when we look back to 11 years ago at the time of the Fukushima disaster as well, of course, if nuclear power plants are stopped, they take some time to be brought back onto the grid as well. So we need to look at these facts, including the risks, but including these costs and times as well. I would like to look at some of the positive points of these past 11 years as well. This is what Mr. Trittin referred to as well, is that, for example, the cost of solar has gone to 1/10 of what it was compared to a decade ago. For someone who's been involved in the field of renewables for 30 years, I couldn't have even imagined 10 years ago that the solar costs would become the cheapest energy. In Japan, it's not quite up to that, but if we look at globally in most countries around the world, solar is become the cheapest available form of electricity. And of course, there are short-term fluctuations and so on. But if we look at the long-term trends, we can see that solar is continuing to become cheaper. Wind is also 3/10 of the cost of it was 10 years ago. And we will continue seeing a decrease in the cost for wind as well. So the fact that this is compared to nuclear, it's not something that takes decades to prepare, and it's much cheaper. Looking at how do we deal with the climate crisis and also the resource crisis that the world is now seeing, looking at the following the situation of Ukraine, renewables is the answer to this. It is clear that nuclear power is not the way to resolve these issues. As the statistics show us as well, 11 years ago, solar was, for example, it was only around 1.1% of the global energy. But last year, solar was 4% of the global electricity and wind 6.4%. So in the past 10 years, we can see that this has increased tenfold in just the past decade. So in another 10 years, well, will it become 100%? Of course, maybe that won't necessarily be the case, but we can see that through this system, it continues to increase. It may continue to increase, tensfolds from here as well. And within this, we see, for example, Germany, as Mr. Trittin said as well, looking at creating the new laws in Germany. At the time, renewables was only around 5%. And a lot of that was also hydro related. But we've seen how this has increased a huge amount since then as well, to 20%, to 45%, even last year, close to 50%, for example. And so by 2030, we can see that these goals completely increasing, but also being realized as well. Another 10 years, for example, we really see that there is a huge potential for these ambitious goals to indeed be achieved. Another very happy surprise in the past 10 years was the fact that battery technology became dramatically cheaper as well. Similar to solar, the batteries have also become around 1/10 of the cost of 10 years ago as well. Of course, this has a great amount to do with Tesla in the United States, but looking at the momentum that was brought in place in regards to battery technology and having the same effect in place for just 1/10 of the cost. And with Australia, the US, and Europe, we can see that currently these kind of batteries are around 90% used for electric vehicles, and in around 80,000, around 80% of the vehicles created last year were EVs. Japan is very behind on this, actually. Only around 1% of cars are EVs here in Japan, but we can see that the automobile industry also moving towards more using of these new technology. Until now, this kind of battery technology had been extremely expensive, so very difficult to use. This is maybe similar to what people thought about solar 10 years ago as well. Things which people thought were too expensive to be easily accessible have become just 1/10 of the price. And the same thing can be said for batteries as well. We can see this similar speed, the cost becoming so much better. So this electricity and mobility connected as well, and really changing industry overall. This is the era that we are today standing in. So when we, of course, think within this context, there was then Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so in, of course, this terrible situation, we can see people jumping onto these things such as nuclear sharing or nuclear power, which are completely based not on facts. There are people trying to use this opportunity to go towards this. But under the new administration in Germany, we have seen not going in this direction, but seeing that renewable energy is there for the purpose of independence, both regional independence, personal independence, state level independence. It's something which gives us a great encouragement, I believe, and really courage indeed. When we think about this past decade and we think about what kind of changes and what chance there is for an even greater transformation in the coming decade, I think that Germany is showing us the path in this direction. And for those of us here in Japan, unfortunately, we are still dragging our feet somewhat, but we have a great challenge ahead of us to make an impact as well. As I mentioned, the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu's words in the beginning, I said that difficult problems are best solved while they are easy. But at the same time, the most difficult problems in life always start off being simple, but they're best to resolve when they are still small as well. Otherwise, indeed, they will just continue to grow larger. And I think this is really what we consider today about for this mayor's network, looking at how to break away from nuclear power and have more renewable. I think that Germany's path, Germany's implementation of the FIT in the law 20 years ago, for example, which might have seemed like small steps at the time, but which have made complete changes. Aachen, of course, in Germany was one of the first places to create this model for the FIT. Then we saw when the Greens became part of the ruling coalition, bringing this into the federal policy. So these local municipalities creating these new models, creating new steps, and the momentum to bring this to a national level and globally and connect to the future as well. I truly believe so.
Thank you. Now we would like to move to questions and answers. Mr. Kan Naoto is here still. And he spoke about the farming type solar power. And then Jürgen Trittin, Mr. Jürgen Trittin spoke to us about the progress of the renewable energy and nuclear-free progress and path in Germany. Mr. Jürgen Trittin, in 2018, they has become the head of, is leading up the environment for the nuclear waste disposal as well. So, but there are many questions that we can ask him regarding all of the negative activities as well as very positive and encouraging activities that have happened in the past decades. We have many people who have joined us online as well as people who have joined online from the media. Unfortunately, Mr. Jürgen Trittin will be leaving after the Q&A session, so this will be your last opportunity to ask. Please turn on your microphone. I have a question to Mr. Trittin. In Germany, in some portions of Germany, the energy prices are rising, and that starting from December, they were planning to phase out the nuclear power, but there is now a strong opposition to continue nuclear power. Do you believe that you will be able to really stop nuclear power in December? Will you be able to answer now at this time?
Let me give you two answers to that. One is the rising of the energy prices. The rising of the energy prices is a global phenomenon. It hits all countries of the European Union and a lot of countries outside Europe as well. It is a fossil inflation. The rising of gas prices is the main the rising of gas prices is the main cause for the rising of electricity prices. In Germany, it's not that complicated on the gas sector because mostly gas is used in Germany for heating and industrial processes. But because we have a common electricity market, it had this influx also for our electricity prices. What do we have to do in that situation? We have to strengthen those energies that are cheap. And the truth is, the sun and the wind do not send a bill to us. So in a longer perspective, it is necessary to overcome the dependency from fossil energies to limit the increase of prices for electricity. And that leads to the second answer. The second answer is that because we have a problem going away from coal, oil, and gas from Russia. That is what we in the government are now organizing. There is a European coal embargo on Russian coal starting from now. We're working very hardly to stop the import of oil also in this summer from Russia. And we have also to substitute the gas dependency. The problem is not a German one. The problem is a global one. If Europe cuts its gas links and pipelines to Russia, we take one fifth of the global gas production out of the market. It's really out of the market. Russia is not able to sell this gas elsewhere because it's linked to pipelines to Europe. If we cut this 150 billion cubic meters, these 150 billion cubic meters are globally no longer reachable and can't be sold. That is a problem. We together in international cooperation have to organize, and that's the reason why we think that phasing out the import of Russian gas to Europe has a perspective up to the year of 2025. Let me make a last side remark. There is a myth that Germany can afford the phasing out of nuclear only because there's France, and some people also quote Czechia for getting imported electricity. Yes, there is a European electricity market with imports and exports. But in a net, Germany exported more electricity than it is importing. And this winter, in a time where 25% of the nuclear power plant
Unfortunately, he has dropped off from the line. I'm wondering if he's going to answer my question, because I was asking about whether the nuclear power plants are really going to be shut down in December of this year. I just want to announce that we are still waiting for connection of Mr. Trittin, but Mr. Iida, will you be able to answer this question? Is it true that there is a discussion, ongoing discussion? Yes, we have heard that there are discussions regarding this, but in the Greens and the current ruling party, all of this is decided by law and acts. To actually change the law, it will take several years to change, and therefore it will be difficult to continue using nuclear power without changing the law, and it will take more time to change the law, and it will not happen by December. And in Germany, the natural gas peak appears in the winter time when there are heating needs. And regardless of whether there is a base load from nuclear power, it does not really help in the natural gas import. The Greens party, Mr. Harvest said that this was a moot discussion because Germany is very strict regarding following their laws, and therefore, if we bring both of these two parts together, we believe that it will be very difficult to believe that the extension will happen regarding the nuclear power plants past December of this year. And Ms. Miranda has also made speeches regarding the stopping nuclear power by the end of this year.
So I would like to make a response to that. So you mentioned that there's no time to change the law in that, but I don't necessarily think that that's the case. Looking at, for example, after the Fukushima disaster, the Chancellor Merkel at the time started the ethics committee and changed the law within 1 year. I think that initially they had planned to have a lot longer than that, but they really made a very swift change there to the law that took less than a year. So I believe that in Germany, it actually takes less than a year to make these kind of changes. So I'm not sure if just the law time required is a point. So well, that's something that was written in the media, so I shared that point. But rather than that, I think the strongest point is not so much that it would take more time for law, is that it's a strong will of the decision of the current government to not make this kind of change, and that it's also not useful for the electricity. So the legal point, of course, I'm not familiar with all of the small details and so on, but that was some of the larger points as well, to share some information about this as well. It's, you know, looking at something, it's also looking at, for example, they'd have to change all of their plans as well, have, you know, new obtaining of nuclear fuel. And so I don't think it's realistic for them to change their plan completely. It's so in Germany at the moment, the plans for realizing there are many different other related laws. It's not just one single law as well. Mr. Kan, of course, having the opportunity to have you here today, I wonder if we could ask you to share about some of the draft bill on the nuclear phase out, which you and other multi-party members submitted. As far as I'm aware, I believe that, well, it might not be a very full answer, but in Germany, of course, they have just had the new government come into place. And so I think that, well, it's not, you know, it's not likely that it would just return to the previous situation. And in regards to this, the draft law, for example, well, I think our current law hasn't reached the diet in Japan as well. And so does this mean that you're planning to, or the draft law was submitted under the previous government, so are you thinking to submit this in the new government now as well? I believe that you're also looking at draft bills, for example, about the decommissioning as well. So we haven't given up indeed on this yet, but looking at, you know, as the central people involved in this, they're discussing about what kind of, looking at the past draft bills which were submitted and seeing how, well, not necessarily having the political strength to be able to put this through with not enough people, for example, within the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, and looking at the current situation about how to go forward as well from here. But I am not sure of the most recent situation. Thank you very much for that. It seems that unfortunately, Mr. Trittin has not been able to come back to the Zoom. We do still have Mr. Iida and Mr. Kan here, so we'll go ahead with questions to them. I couldn't understand all of the German points, so I won't be able to make a comment there, but in relation to PV and in Japan as well, looking at the different reports here and looking at how we respond to this, what kind of discussions, I think there's a lot to be done in the diet in Japan about this as well. So I would like to speak about this. Until August of last year, I saw that solar generation was, I believe that this was, well, simply I understood it as probably the most positive or the best of renewables. But in a particular newspaper article, there was a discussion about the solar generation in Ibaraki Prefecture, and it seemed that there were many problems in place there as well, saying that it can also be a reason, for example, for destruction of nature, and there were many different cases in regards to this as well. And so looking at, for example, there are more than 4 million kilowatts of, or gigawatts, sorry, of solar, which is more than the Tokai village nuclear power plant was. There's more energy in that sense as well. There is different data in regards to this. If we look at mega solar, I think it's also more than 2 plants worth as well. So what is the issue at hand then? I think within this month, for example, looking at the area where I live, it seems, for example, in rice fields and some of these different areas as well, there are many different large plants which are being made. One is around 2 kilometers away from my place. There is a 64-hectare forest area, which in November last year, a new solar panels were fixed. This is something that I think if we look at the destruction of the forest area, for example, and some of these mega solar, which is in place there as well, I think that it's clear that there will be an impact on the region on the area as well, and also seeing in places such as Katsuya as well, can also see that there is some damage being caused by solar plants actually. But as we mentioned, solar is of course in 50, 60 hectare areas rather than this. It's something which can be done on very small levels. There are many more done rather than these mega ones, but even small places, which means that even if there is a negative impact, it's perhaps only on that one house, two house, that small limited regional area, not to the next village and so on. So the impacts are on a much smaller levels. It's, for example, destroying one rice field or also having impacts on people's houses where they build and so on. There are many cases of this as well. But what is the issue is that, well, being done without any order, shall we say, for these kind of, it's not possible unless you're someone with influence to really stop this large buildings, and the fact that there's not enough regulations, for example, or loose regulations on the national level as well. Even if bylaws are created on the local municipality level, then they will not have enough force to be able to restrict these as well. And so looking at, in that case, for example, something which was several years ago, there was even a lawsuit in regards to this, and the prefectural government actually lost in regards to that. And so on the local municipal level and bylaws and so on, they are not able to make an impact in regards to this. In Ibaraki Prefecture, there were many different things done on the prefectural assembly level last year, but it hasn't gone to the level of becoming prefectural law as such. In that regards, I'm not trying to say that solar panel is bad as such, but saying for destroying agricultural fields or having non-order destruction of forests and so on, there needs to be some way to put a stop to this being done without any full planning as well. This was an article in the Mainichi newspaper, but I think that looking at on the level of the people in charge of things on the bureaucratic level and so on, asking about, is it okay to really just go ahead with this as well? In Ibaraki Prefecture, I went to hear from the people in charge there as well. And they spoke, for example, on the level of the people in charge in the offices, for example, or also on the mayor level as well. I heard that it's not possible for them to put a stop to plans, even if they don't feel that they agree with. And so we want something to be done on the national level. In regards to that, looking at, well, solar panel is, of course, does have many benefits, but on the actual site, there are these kind of issues about this development being done without any kind of planning or order and so on, and having these negative impacts. What kind of regulations are required for this? If you look online, of course, there are, many, I get a lot of advertisements promoting solar and so on. It's things of interest. There are drones, for example, going around looking for places, and direct mails being sent to people, farmers who have land which could maybe be used for solar and so on. So I wonder if we could ask Mr. Kan or Mr. Iida to make a response about this as well. If we could ask either of them. Thank you very much. Mr. Trittin has actually just returned to the chat. So we had this question now, but Mr. Trittin was still responding to the question we had before about whether Germany will indeed really have its nuclear phase out this year. Mr. Trittin, welcome back. I hope that your connection is going well now. The question we had before is, will Germany really have all of its nuclear power plants off by the end of this year? Will that be realized? Looking at the Ukraine situation, there are perhaps threats to this at the moment as well. And there are voices saying that this might be delayed. Will Germany really achieve all of its nuclear power plants being turned off within this year? Mr. Trittin, over to you.
I'm convinced it will, because it's only 3 nuclear power plants, and the prolongation of the lifetime of these nuclear power plants and the new start of producing new nuclear waste has to be waged against the situation that it won't help. With running these 3 power plants, there is no gram of gas more for our industry and for heating our buildings. And that's the reason why the legal way will be done at that time. So the answer is simply yes, we will phase out.
Thank you very much for your answer. And while you were away, there has been multiple other questions regarding solar power in Japan. There was report of some issues that we are facing regarding solar energy production, that it is harming the environment, that it is damaging our natural environment. And I would like to now ask Mr. Kan and Mr. Iida to comment. And then after this, I would also like to ask you if you are experiencing any environmental destruction or wind power and also environmental destruction. And if you have had these issues, how you had overcome these issues. So we will ask you for your answer later on. Regarding this issue, I have been working together with the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery. The farming land cannot be used for other purposes but for farming. Of course, if it was legally transformed into housing land, then this is a different story. The farming land, it is protected by law that you cannot build buildings. This has not changed. But 10 years ago, if you continue farming, you can build pillars to put the solar panels above the farming areas. This was approved by the ministry. And within this exclusion, it is actually being conducted. All of the small solar power plots are actually plots that have been converted away from farming land, meaning that the ministry has, as long as the land is being categorized as farming land, they will not have been able to make solar power farms in farming land, so that it cannot be any vendor coming in to build solar power farms instead of having it being farmable land. The only exception I mentioned is the construction of the pillars to put up the solar panels above the farming land while farming is still continuing under the solar panel. And many of the new solar power plots have been created in areas where it is a forest area, where it's not being protected by law, and also farmland that have already been pre-converted to other purposes that have been now being converted to solar power plots. The type of solar power that I am proposing is the farming type solar power, which is to conduct solar power generation above farmable land where farming will continue under the solar power panels. And the ministry is also very strongly interested in continuing farmers to farm under the solar panel. And I believe that this also is a good way to protect the farmland as well as to protect the environment and also to generate electricity as well. So you need to separate the illegal solar power plots that have been created on illegal land. And if farming amount of crops that can be harvested is cut below 70% of what it used to be able to grow, then this is seen as a misuse of the solar power. And therefore, but in the current situation, not many situations have arisen in that case. Instead of continuing with asking your additional questions, let's ask the panelists to give their answers first. Iida-san, can you also comment on this issue? I also believe there is one key issue that we needed to communicate to you. One is to phase out nuclear energy and also to phase out from fossil fuels. We need solar power and wind power to phase these two out and to protect the existence of human race and also the protection of our environment. This is the key. Japan is very highly populated and is a high consumption of energy. In the current technology of solar power and also looking at the 3% of our land needed to be covered with solar panels. That how we divide up that 3% across the land of Japan is one issue. The other possibility is wind power, which is still slow in Japan. So we first need to focus on creating more solar power in Japan. The next stage is to the illegal conversion of forest and farming land. In Japan, there is a very big issue in the Japanese historically. The agriculture law in Japan is extremely strict, as Mr. Kan just mentioned, but the forest land is actually unprotected, meaning that forests can be cut down and there is very little protection of the forest land. So that if you just put in one piece of paper, you can create resorts or golf courses or solar panel farms. So that is how unprotected the woods and the forests of Japan are. But the agricultural land in Japan is extremely highly protected. So it is very unbalanced. This is the reason why when the 40 yen price was kept at for in the FIT, then many people decided that it would be more beneficial to clear out a forest and then create solar panel farms. This was the problem that we faced when solar power cost kept on going down, but the FIT cost never went down. From also a statistical point of view, we want to create solar panels on areas that have already been developed by humans, meaning on top of roofs of buildings and houses. We should put all of the solar panels on all roofs. Also, there are new technology that will be able to produce about 90% of electricity of regular solar panels, and these can be used like fences or walls. This is also being developed in Germany as well. Another thing that we also need to look at is to look at GIS geo data. When we look at the 1/4 of electricity, if we put solar panels on all houses in Japan that can put solar panels, it will be 1/4 of our electricity. And therefore, the largest area of developed land that we could put in the solar panels is the agricultural land. And as Mr. Kan mentioned, we can create 3 times more of what we need by if we put it into all farming land. So we don't actually need to even put it on all of the agricultural land. We need to create good candidates for putting these solar panels in areas where we will be able to create good farming and also good solar power. In Germany, for low producing agricultural land, they have allowed for conversion to solar panel farms. But in Japan, there is a lot of silos of the ministry and the bureaucracy. And therefore, we need to think about a cross-ministry, cross-bureaucracy development where we can create a new type of framework and structure where we will be able to look at renewable energy, where the municipalities and the local communities can start thinking about how they will be able to develop their renewable energy. This is something we should have thought about a decade or so ago, but we are finally at a place where the municipalities can create plans as to where they will create renewable energy locations and where they cannot develop and build new renewable energy sources. And this is some of the things that we will be looking at. And there is one new step towards creating this type of structure. Now we would like to ask Mr. Trittin for his comment. What we have been discussing while you were away is that we do need more solar power, but we don't want to have a situation where it destroys our forest and natural environment. In Germany, in moving to the solar power and renewable energy, what did you experience any type of issues with environmental destruction? And if you have, what were measures you took to stop or eliminate these types of threats?
I think it is obvious that you have a conflict if you build up new capacities for renewable energies. You also can get into conflict with agriculture, with fishery, with nature conservation and other targets. So if you look on how we did it in Germany, we tried to minimize these conflicts. What is the reason why our offshore wind parks are in the more deep sea of the North Sea? It's very simple. The whole coastline of the North Sea is wetlands, and this is protected. It's in many cases national parks. So we put the offshore wind parks in the deeper sea outside this national parks. This is also for protection of birds, for example, that use the wetlands for resting on the way as migrating species from the north to the south. But on the other side, we are very clear what is the overarching target. The overarching target is to bring the world below the 1.5 degree target. Climate change is the biggest threat for biodiversity you can think about. So now we introduce with the ISEP package a new regulation, and it contains one regulation that obliges all federal states to reserve 2% of their area for the use of wind energy. We have a similar regulation in nature conservation. The states are also obliged to reserve 5%, that's more than double like for wind, for nature protection reasons. This is older one, we launched it 20 years ago. But now we add 2% for wind use of wind, because we think under the climate conditions of Germany, the use of wind is the most efficient way to increase the amount of generated electricity by renewables. And we did a second step. Under the new regulation, every new building has to have photovoltaic mains, solar panels on the rooftop. It's not allowed to build a new building without that. And we did a third thing. In these houses, it's forbidden, starting with next year, to build in gas-fired heating systems, oil or gas-fired heating systems. So you see, we are aware on the conflicts but try to minimize these conflicts. And one of the reasons why I talked about public interest and public safety is that we have to balance out the question of biodiversity and climate protection in a way that help us to save nature and on the other side build up that. What you are discussing, as I listened, on the question how what we called agro photovoltaic, solar panels, we use this in low intensity areas of agriculture. I'm very much in favor of using in these areas and looking stronger for wind, because with wind turbines on the field, you can use the field nearly as normal. So that is the reason why we have a very much higher share of wind electricity compared to PV. But I do not understand enough from the Japanese agriculture and the area situation, because I think you have much more mountains than we have over your whole country. So you have to decide. There is a conflict, but I think you can solve the conflict in a way that both sides, biodiversity, agriculture on one side, and climate protection fits together.
Thank you. I understand about the macro situation, and I truly believe that is so. But looking at the micro situation where I can actually see, and it is true that agricultural land, unless converted, you cannot build on agricultural land. That I understand. And high class or well-producing agricultural land is being used as agricultural land and cannot be converted. But these are the areas that are currently being developed by developers for solar power are the farming areas that are currently not being farmed, or farming land that have low productivity. And this is the problem that I see, that in mountainous areas or areas where there are not very heavily populated, these plots that have been missed or not noticed are being converted into solar areas, and these are not being controlled or looked after. And there needs to be some kind of a national regulation, because if not, we will see these things popping up all over the place. We really need not just to look at the macro situation, but to look at the actual situation that is happening in each region and location. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Anyone else with other questions?
Can I make a remark from my side?
Yes, please.
If I look on the micro situation and I compare this with the situation, especially in the north of Germany, a lot of farmers became very, I won't say rich, but wealthy by introducing wind turbines on their fields. So they could go on producing potatoes, wheat, and other things, but they had the money from those who run the wind turbines. So in a micro situation, renewable energies, especially in the north of Germany, within the farmer communities, are very popular. Many of the inhabitants of the small villages are shareholders of these wind turbines. They have their money spent there and invested there and got a good return, about 6 to 8% for the invested capital every year. So on a micro situation, in many areas of Germany, wind energy and renewable energy is, especially in the farming population, very much popular. There is, to be true on that, also a conflict. If you go more to the south, this is not the case, but I think it's more a cultural situation. And our government is doing a lot to bring people to see the chances of producing electricity on their areas, because this is producing also income to the farmers.
Thank you very much for your comment. Solar power is a key issue that we need to further to solve the issues that we currently face, but also, as Mr. Kam mentioned, to put in the farming type solar power, we will be able to continue to protect our farming land and also be able to create farmland that will be farmed and also used as solar power. We also, as the question has mentioned, we need to have regulations so that the solar power generation plots do not go unrestricted. Now, next question, please, from Sakurai-san.
From me, I have one thing I would like to introduce and one question also. This is Mr. Sakurai, the former mayor of Minamisouma city in Fukushima. In 2011, at the time of the disaster, of course, I became certain, because of what we experienced, that it is not possible for us to coexist with nuclear power. And so we created a new vision for our city as Minamisouma city, for a nuclear phase out as the city, and to have a new future vision. And so being able to have 100% of the energy we consumed coming from renewables was the goal that we set in Minamisouma city. And looking at the amount required, actually, as of this year, we have actually already achieved being able to produce enough, to generate enough as we needed. This is through solar sharing. This is also through using some agricultural areas and also having PV panels and wind being increased within our area as well. However, currently, as Mr. Masaki, who was raising this question about the issue of damage to land and so on, there were some cases that I cannot deny where indeed those companies which were very fast in coming part of this did carry out this development, not in a very safe or thorough way, shall we say. However, there are different measures which have been made to place in how to adapt to this, how to make sure that there is reduced impact by, for example, changing the way that these kind of energy generation was done. But looking at the fact that even with such a low cost for solar at the moment, within the companies, there are still some issues in regards to, which companies who are going on. I would like an opportunity later maybe to talk further with Mr. Iida, who is an expert on this issue, to look at, now that, I think PV has come down to around 10 Japanese yen, but looking at what kind of merits will there be to sort of further promote these particular kinds of solar. So I wonder if I could ask Mr. Iida a little bit about the situation of solar in Japan at the moment. Yes, in regards to, well, solar and wind, the same thing could be said, but for both of them, the construction and also the maintenance, well, the maintenance fees are not so much. It's mostly the construction costs, which is to be considered. But Japan is actually, looking at a global comparison, probably extremely high. Probably it's in line with Russia, perhaps. It's more than 1.5 times the cost of what it is in Germany. And what is making it more expensive here in Japan is, first of all, the solar panels themselves, and also the materials themselves are not very expensive here in Japan. It's, they're available for similar costs everywhere in the world, but it's the different soft costs, the sort of soft trading costs and so on. And some of this is due to the costs for the regulations on the national government side. That's around half. And another half is the different companies which are involved in the middle of this process, taking out fees and costs along the way, for this. So it's the cost which is put on top of the actual construction cost is very high here in Japan. Unless there is a change being done in that, Japan will not come to a similar or costs in line with other places around the world. So the current, even at 10 yen at the moment, they are actually still making great profits, very high profits off this as well. So rather than an issue of cost, what is expanding at the moment is looking within not the FIT system, but looking at corporations, for example, having generating electricity on their own roofs and so on, and then using them to reduce their costs of their consumption. And that's a way to have their income raised, for example. Or large companies, for example, having long-term systems or long-term contracts for having secured supply of electricity separate from the FIT system. So these are some of the different things which we're seeing now in Japan to try and reduce these costs of solar, which can help to have more entering these markets as well. So this is where the 10 yen is still much cheaper than it was before. And I think that if these costs can be reduced, it will become even cheaper here in Japan as well. There was the discussion also about the agricultural committee and the restrictions, regulations here in Japan and so on. That's one aspect, but for the side which is developing the renewable energy as well, sometimes it can mean that it's 1 year or 2 years for the approvals and so on. And so is this also a positive thing that we want? Roof situation is fairly good, but for example, if people are trying to, well, there are different legal obstructions for having PV panels on top of garage roofs, for example. It takes many years, many months and thousands of dollars, thousands of euro to get through that. So a lot of these micro costs in Japan there's many different obstacles in place. So the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry has put the brakes on a lot of this as well by having very old systems in place, which means that it's not easy, and it's really not in touch with, it doesn't have this sense of urgency in regards to the energy crisis, the climate crisis. And these are things which are obstacles at the moment. I think those of you who are members of this mayor's network, of course, have different things as well, but there's really piecemeal issues as well. They're doing what should have been done 10 years ago today, rather than looking 10 years in the future and looking at the urgency which is needed in order to do these, which ends up costing a lot more in the long run as well. And this leads to the kind of questions we had before as well. Of course, we need to make sure that there is the full consensus and agreement, permissions and so on in the local aspect, and those rules are very important, but we need to have a balance between making sure that this can be implemented in a speedy way to deal with the urgency of this crisis. For Japan to really hurry as needed in the energy transition, it needs to have a cost down, a speed up, and local consensus, regional consensus as well. Thank you very much. Any further questions? We're coming up to the end of this session. If any media representatives would like to ask a last question while we have Mr. Trittin with us. Mr. Tanaka, please go ahead.
Mr. Tanaka, you're on mute. Mr. Kan, Mr. Iida, thank you very much. 23 years ago, when I was elected as mayor, you came to cheer me on. I was the mayor for Shimanto City. I have the same issues. I'm facing the same issue, meaning that beautiful natural areas are being converted into solar power farms, and also beautiful mountains are being destroyed for putting on wind turbines. I want to move away from nuclear power, but I am also against destruction of natural areas for the creation of renewable energy as well. This is in a way somewhat contradicting. But we, as Matsuzaki-san, Mr. Matsuzaki, we are all facing the same type of issues in our local areas, and we need to come up with some kind of solution to overcome these major blockages and conflicts. We really need a good solution, and we need advice, and we believe we also need to change some natural laws, or else we believe that we will not be able to coexist with renewable energy. This is something that the natural legislation, as well as the diet, as well as the discussion at a natural level will be required. That is just the last comment I wanted to make before the end of the session. In the material that I have provided to you, I have provided two materials. Please look at the material called Material 2. This is a guidebook for the creation of farming style solar power. This is being published by the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. There are many case studies also covered in this guidebook. This farming type solar power is a new idea, and only 2,653 farms have started with this system. But the ministry really wants to develop this type of solar power. Please utilize this material. Thank you. I also want to make one last comment. As both Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Takasa mentioned, I know that there needs to be a change in the national government, but I also want to tell you from experience that in history, there is nothing that have come starting from the national government that was really good. The most important thing is to develop something in the local community, in the local government, and to start with a good idea that will be able to spread across. Even in Germany, it came from a small village first. The idea came from a small village first. The Japanese Birds Association, Natural Birds Association, and WWF, and many of these types of organizations, we are looking at renewable energy, solar and wind, that will be able to coexist with the local community and the natural environment. And we are coming up with a rule book. And I believe that Ogata village is an area where there are a lot of great birds, natural birds, but this is an area where there will be also wind turbines, and we are putting in a location where we are in discussion with the natural bird groups to put in the wind turbine. And also in the Shimanto town, I'm sure there are people who would be interested in natural conservation and the type of solar power that will be able to, and also small level hydroelectricity or other types of renewable energy, that we will be able to create some kind of zoning. We need to come up with a new structure that will work well in Japan, and to actually make that a reality, and that project will then be able to spread across. In the UK, this was also a situation. In the Royal Bird Institute they created their own wind turbine. And that was one step towards being more accepting to wind turbines in the UK. So we need to have the local communities and the local governments and the municipalities, to stop nuclear power and to create success stories of renewable energy in your local community. And our institute will be greatly interested in supporting you in those purposes. I also want to ask Mr. Trittin, who has joined from Germany at such early morning in Germany, for your last concluding remarks. Or is this a question to Mr. Trittin? Because Mr. Trittin needs to leave, and I just wanted to get one last word from Mr. Trittin before we move into the press meeting, which Mr. Trittin will not be joining. So Mr. Trittin, your final words, please.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me and an honor today to attend your meeting. And I learned a lot, because sometimes the problems in increasing renewable energies are similar, but also different. In Germany, it's not the big conflict between solar energy and agricultural use. It's a conflict between wind and nature conservation. And I think it's true. We have to solve these problems, and you can solve these problems only with a national regulation. But at the end, what a society has to ask itself are two questions. Is this worth to go on risking a world where a new Fukushima is possible? And the second question we all have to answer, is it worth to live in a world where a new Hiroshima or Nagasaki is possible? And I think my answer is clear. We have to denuclearize the world, and the best thing to denuclearize is a massive increase of the capacities of renewable energies, that this is not only avoiding the nuclear dangers, but also protecting our heritage for our children and grandchildren. It's the climate. Thank you for your attention. For me this morning, for you this afternoon, and my best wishes to all of you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Trittin, thank you so much for these wonderful closing remarks. Dankeschön. We very much appreciate your time and wish you all the best. Please feel free to leave when you have to, and we will have some closing words now from Mr. Murakami in Tokyo. Mr. Trittin, thank you so much once again today for joining us all the way from Germany, and also for sharing these very progressive initiatives and also your philosophy really of the world and the future that we have to work towards today. We had some quite heated discussion and debate here as well. Thank you very much to everybody who took part. And also thank you very much, of course, to former Prime Minister Kan Naoto and Mr. Iida Tetsunari for your remarks today as well. I personally, with former Prime Minister Mr. Kan and Mr. Iida, have a very long relationship. We've worked together for many years until now as well. As Tokai village, looking at how we need to achieve the nuclear phase out, being or as a mayor of a city which was host to a nuclear power plant, we really saw what we had to do to bring us away from this risk. And so I was involved in the founding of the Mayors for a Nuclear Power-Free Japan 10 years ago, and have continued to be part. Tokai village, of course, is host to the Tokai nuclear plant. In around December this year, there was discussion of restart of the plant there. The construction is delayed, and it's now changed to several years in the future from now as well. But there is a very strong movement with huge amounts of money being invested into this as well, into trying to restart and construction toward the restart of the plant. But at the same time, the Tokai Dai-ni, the second nuclear power plant there is also a very strong movement to stop this from restarting. We also had legal actions that we took as well, showing that the nuclear plant is not up to standards and so on. In March of last year, there was then a legal verdict saying that it is not permitted to restart the plant. But the citizens movement, it's somehow become somewhat weaker, I would say, as well. Today, we have 4 people here from Ibaraki Prefecture, including current and former village, town and city mayors. But the movement has not had so much action rather lately as well. I believe that today's session was indeed very heated debate and very useful, very good timing for us to have this discussion as well. I would have hoped we could, of course, have more people joining us today, but I think this was indeed very meaningful. We have people joining us today, both in person in Tokyo and also online. Thank you to everybody who joined us today for what I believe was a very productive meeting. Thank you very much to former Prime Minister, not Mr. Suga, he's not very good, Mr. Kan. This is a joke as they have the same characters in Japanese. But Mr. Kan Naoto, former Prime Minister, thank you very much for your words, and also our resource person, Mr. Iida Tetsunari. We very much appreciate the constructive contributions which you made today. On behalf of all of the mayors for a nuclear power-free Japan, I would like to close today's symposium. Once again, thank you very much today, everybody. Mr. Kan, Mr. Iida, once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing to cooperate together. This brings us to a close of the symposium. Following this will be a press conference, but English translation will not be available for the press conference. This brings to a conclusion for the English information today. Thank you very much.